My name is Bob. Back in 1998, there was this joint military exercise called BT-98. I remember it clearly because every year, the name of the exercise included the year. It was a combined training with our ally nations, and since our country has tropical jungles in Southeast Asia and is an ally, we hosted the training every year. I was an officer who spoke English, so my unit sent me to participate in the exercise. The training was similar to SEAL training, but not in the sea. It took place in reservoirs and dams using rubber boats. We trained in tracking, stalking, and jungle survival, including eating whatever the jungle offered. The smaller units focused on map and compass use, with both day and night sessions. It was during the night training that things got interesting. The day training went smoothly. We walked, trained, and nothing unusual happened. But at night, the foreign soldiers had advanced technology, while my unit used old-fashioned compasses and maps. Their commander insisted on using these old tools to toughen up their soldiers. The night training had 9 teams, each with 2 soldiers, one from my country and one from theirs. The instructors had pre-marked coordinates in the jungle, and we had to navigate from one point to another using clues at each location. After the day session, we waited until 8 p.m. when it was completely dark. My partner was Sergeant Tony, and we were the last team to be dropped off from the military truck. It was March, during the dry season in our tropical jungle under a full moon. The bright moonlight was helpful, making it easier to see despite the darkness. The forest, with its changing leaves, had a distinct contrast that night, making navigation slightly easier. Once we were dropped off, Tony and I set our bearings for the first waypoint. Though the moon provided some light, it was still a jungle, and Tony wasn't used to it. We had a backup plan to return to the starting point using reverse compass bearings, and I made sure Tony understood the importance of staying calm if we encountered anything strange. My culture teaches me not to react to anything odd in the jungle, to stay silent and composed. Tony, having a wife from my country, respected and understood this advice. I let Tony take the lead to help him gain confidence with the compass, while I followed closely, counting our steps. Accuracy was crucial, because even a small error could throw us off by hundreds of meters. As we navigated, the first checkpoint was just a small tree stump with a clue. Everything went smoothly at first. We walked through the familiar forest, under the moonlight. Then, out of nowhere, Tony stopped and turned to me, whispering, "Bob, do you see that?" He pointed to a pair of red eyes, just a foot or so off the ground. From my experience, I figured it was a nocturnal animal. I reassured Tony it was probably nothing, and we moved on. We trekked another 2 kilometers. The jungle, vast and dense, covering around 400 square miles. Then Tony stopped again, this time tilting his head back and giving a thumbs up over his shoulder, signaling for me to look. He asked again, "You see that? You see that?" This time, it was a large tree branch swaying above us. The tree was swaying back and forth, a big branch moving. I figured it was probably just a different kind of monkey jumping around at night. But Tony didn't buy it. He insisted he hadn't seen a monkey. Tony kept saying he hadn't seen a monkey, but didn't see anything else either, even though the tree was moving a lot. Tony then said, if it was a monkey, it had to be a giant one because the tree was shaking so hard. I had a feeling we were about to encounter something, but I wasn't sure because I hadn't seen it myself. I didn't tell Tony because I wasn't certain. We couldn't pinpoint what it was, so I tried to stay positive and hoped it was nothing. We kept walking. About 500 meters later, we were approaching our first checkpoint. Suddenly, Tony stopped and turned to me. "Bob, you see that?" "Bob, you see that?" Tony asked for the 3rd time, pointing over his shoulder, but not down low up high. I looked where Tony was pointing and saw, about 100 meters away, a tall figure. It was standing on a ridge, silhouetted against the moonlight. This wasn't just a tall person, it was towering, at least 10 meters high. I realized then what we had stumbled upon. In my mind, I thought, now we've really found something. The problem was, our first checkpoint was close to that tall figure. No matter what, we had to get to that point. Tony didn't want to move forward. I had to coax him, reminding him that he was special forces, and that failing this mission would be embarrassing. I had to persuade him hard because he was pretty shaken up. We slowly moved forward, using an old-school compass and map. The creature wasn't paying attention to us. It seemed fixated on something across the valley, swaying slightly, not standing completely still. I was scared. I'd only ever encountered shadows, sounds, or smells. Never something this huge and real. Tony was visibly shaking. But we couldn't just run away. We had a job to do. Tony ended up walking behind me, pulling on my backpack every few steps, nearly choking me. But we pushed through until we reached a tree where our first checkpoint was hidden. We grabbed the paper with our next coordinates and quickly walked away, trying not to draw attention. With the first checkpoint done, we had to return to our starting point. Tony took the lead, rushing back, muttering about our bad luck. I told him we had to endure it. We made it back to the start and headed for the second checkpoint. Tony had calmed down a bit, and this leg of the journey was easier since it led us away from where we saw the creature. We followed our route, reaching the second checkpoint, then the third checkpoint. But when we reached the fourth, Tony cursed, "What?" The fourth checkpoint led us back towards the small mountain where we had seen the creature. I figured out that the test course was designed in a star pattern, ensuring trainees stayed within a certain area if they got lost. I told Tony we had to go, reminding him of his duty as the second in command. Tony was reluctant, but eventually agreed after some convincing. I was sweating from fear, too. This was unlike anything I'd ever faced. We moved out, and although we weren't heading exactly to the same spot, we were close enough to still see the creature, towering against the skyline. I couldn't be sure if it was the only one. We kept our heads down and pressed on until we reached the fourth checkpoint. Alright, so we reached the fourth checkpoint, got the coordinates for the fifth one, and then headed back to the starting point. Tony felt relieved, but he mentioned being exhausted and having trouble breathing due to some strange encounters. I was really tired and thirsty too, because Tony had drunk all my water. After a short rest, we checked the coordinates for the fifth checkpoint and realized it was near the finish line. We kept walking, and the journey was uneventful until we reached the fifth checkpoint. Despite our exhaustion and excitement, we managed to get the answer sheet there. We had to collect these sheets from each point as proof of our progress. This last sheet indicated how far we still had to go and the direction to the final rendezvous point. We continued along the path for a while, and I started to sense we were getting close because there was a small, dimly lit road ahead. Entering this area, we knew we were near the final gathering spot. I led the way, not noticing anything unusual, until suddenly, Tony yanked my backpack hard enough to almost knock me over. I asked him what was wrong, and he pointed up, asking if I saw the woman sitting on a tree branch. I didn't see anything at first, but when I stepped back to where Tony had been, I finally saw her. She was sitting high up on a branch, legs dangling, facing the road. I got chills. It was getting dark, and after all the strange things that had happened, my nerves were on edge. We had a clear path to the rendezvous point, but it went right under that tree. I asked Tony if he was up for taking a longer route to avoid it. He said he couldn't take any more and just wanted to finish this mission quickly. I told him if he wanted to get it over with, we had to move fast and go straight through. I took the lead again, and Tony stuck so close he was practically on top of me. As we passed under the tree, keeping a 5-meter distance, there was a ditch we had to cross. Being smaller, I climbed out quickly, but Tony, being larger, struggled. As he clambered up, we heard a woman's laugh coming from the tree, making Tony panic and move even slower. He started yelling for help, and I had to pull him up the rest of the way. Once we were clear, we hurried through a bamboo forest where the rest of the trainees and instructors were gathered. We were the second to last team to arrive out of 9. I handed over our answer sheets to the instructor in charge. He asked if we had seen anything strange, and I replied a bit irritably that we'd seen plenty. Tony went back to his group, cursing and complaining about the ordeal. That night, all the teams were supposed to return by 1 or 2 a.m., but the last team didn't make it back until 5 a.m. They had encountered something similar to what we saw, causing them to scatter in fear and lose their radio, making it impossible to communicate until they finally regrouped and returned. The following morning, during the mission debrief, we shared our experiences. The foreign soldiers were particularly curious about the woman we saw. We explained that, much like their own tales of vampires or ghosts, our country has its own haunted legends. That area is historically significant, a site of old battles and even murders. The woman we saw was said to have hanged herself from that tree, waiting for her husband who never returned. She left a note saying she'd make sure everyone saw her every day until her husband came back. Locals would often see her there at night, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, or even hanging upside down. Eventually, they cut down the tree to stop the sightings. As for the tall creature I saw, I still don't know what it was. He was staring towards another mountain where there was a church at the top. I figured he must have done something wrong and could only stand there looking at the church on the other peak. When I looked around, I realized there were no houses or signs of people in this training area. The training officers told us that no one ventures into these woods because they're scary enough during the day, let alone at night when it's much worse. I remembered what I had told the senior instructor earlier. You wanted me to see something, and I sure did. And that was true. I'll end my story here. That was my past military training experience.